It's a common sci-fi theme. In some far-flung future, us humans have the ability to plug in our brains, upload our minds, and carry on about our business like this, as if nothing had ever happened. And let's face it, backing up our brains to the cloud does have some advantages. Having a digital copy of your consciousness means that it could be backed up and stored indefinitely, effectively making you immortal. And you could pour your mind into any other vessel. Another human, an alien avatar, a robot, or even a global computer network. Divorcing the brain from the biological body would truly allow humans to transcend. But let's get back to reality for a second. Is backing up our brains actually a thing that we can do? Is it even something that we should be trying to do? Well, remarkably, even though it's one of the more out there futures for humanity, it's probably the one with the most promise, with mainstream research and mega investment laying the groundwork right now. Because in order to get our consciousness into the cloud, we first need to understand exactly what consciousness is. And doing that is the goal not only for hopeful transcendence, but for neuroscientists and psychologists everywhere. Oi! Where are you going?
Even starting small, with the goal of simply backing up all the information in our brains, is no mean feat. Our knowledge basically consists of what we can remember, and our memories don't have a neat filing system like a library or even a computer.
In fact, our memories only really exist when we actively recall them, since the act of remembering certain facts strengthens certain pathways in the brain, while others, rarely used, are lost.
So to just take the information that our brain contains, we have to take the whole conscious thinking part as well. And although that really does sound like science fiction, it might actually be more straightforward than you think. Many scientists believe that our consciousness, our thoughts, dreams, internal monologues, and everything that makes us us, is simply a natural result of all the information processing that goes on in the immense neural network of our brains. So to be able to store and run the information and consciousness from a biological brain, you just need to make a digital copy of the entire brain network. No biggie.
It starts with making a map of the brain.
And I'm not talking about one of those cool colour-coded maps of prefrontal cortexes and temporal lobes. This map has to show everything. It has to show all 100 billion neurons and the quadrillion connections between them.
And it doesn't stop at the brain either. To capture all the inputs and outputs, we'd need to incorporate the connections to the spinal cord, sensory receptors all over the body, and muscle cells too.
And how do you get a picture of all the brain's connections? Well, you slice it up, of course.
It's likely that the only way we'll be able to create such a detailed map is by taking paper-thin slices and scanning them one at a time. And yet, because we don't know exactly what causes our consciousness, this still might not be enough. Zooming into each neuron, we might also have to map out the positions and types of individual molecules as they move around, which is a whole other level of complicated. But it might not be impossible. In 2010, scientists imaged a small section of mouse brain in the finest scale details ever achieved of any mammal, with more than 300,000 times the resolution of a normal MRI scan. And you can even help to emulate the workings of a fruit fly's brain on your home computer. But when it comes to capturing all the information contained in the human mind, you need a mammoth amount of computing power. Even at the lowest feasible resolution, a map of the brain's wiring would need a supercomputer that's 1 trillion times more powerful than your home computer, and with 10,000 terabytes of data storage. Again, that sounds impossible, but computer power is increasing all the time, doubling roughly every 18 months, according to Moore's law.
That means that a supercomputer capable of emulating a human brain could be available by 2044. That's just 27 years away. How that mind could function and communicate, well, that's a bridge to be crossed when we get there.
So whole brain emulation may indeed be achievable in our lifetimes, but is it something we'll be looking forward to as much as the next smartphone?
Well, maybe even more so. If we do get there, it would probably mean that we've reached a stage whereby we can control all the inputs and outputs of our digital brain's neural network, meaning that we could upload new information whilst downloading data for other users to share. And if, when you were alive, you were poor at maths or you could never quite get your head around the ending of Inception, well, no problem. Just purchase another upgrade. Death might actually become something to look forward to, a gateway to new information and understanding that you couldn't achieve whilst locked in your fragile human body. And life, as we know it, may become the most tedious part of living.
Your simulation wouldn't even need to run in real time. Running the brain's neural network at higher speeds could lead to new levels of intelligence and problem solving. Yet, unsurprisingly, giving your mind over to the machine has some pretty intense ethical and legal implications. Firstly, thanks to the slicing scanning method of brain mapping, it's not the sort of thing you can dabble in while you're alive. And in the early days of mind uploading, there's no guarantee we'll always get it right. What would it be like to wake up after your death in a digital emulation that didn't work quite right? Broken emulations could cause more than just the blue screen of death, but major suffering for an uploaded consciousness. Even if it all worked perfectly, the transcendent mind could be at risk from the malicious, like deadly computer viruses, or even something as simple and mundane as a power cut. And should emulated brains be considered people, and be given the rights the same as biological humans? And who owns the hardware and software that they run on? And with their brain in the cloud, they're at risk of their mental code being hacked and exposed. How can we ensure the privacy of our innermost thought?
Your brain is incredible. It can learn languages, do sums, and, with some chemical help, even make you see and feel things that aren't really there. Yep, I'm talking about psychedelics, and specifically LSD. Taking LSD is also called dropping acid, and there's a reason for that. It's an acid, easy, lysergic acid diethylamide, if you're being precise. The discovery that LSD made you trip is so famous that we've named a day after it. That's Bicycle Day on April the 19th, 1943. Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, had made a new drug based on compounds found in the ergot fungus. It's worth noting that this gross fungus caused gangrene, convulsions, death, and madness throughout history. And it's because people consumed bread made with rye that was infected with ergot. In fact, it's thought to be the cause of accusations of witchcraft. Hofmann had felt a little strange after working on his new ergot-based drug, so sensibly, he decided to take 1/4 milligram of it and see what happened. His bicycle ride home was strange and terrifying. He believed he couldn't move and that time had stopped. Then, when he got home, his next door neighbour had become a witch, and he found that, as he said, a demon had invaded me and taken possession of my mind, body and soul. Still, he woke the next day apparently feeling amazing and dedicated the rest of his career to studying mind-altering drugs, hoping that they could be used in psychiatry. So, what made him feel what he felt? LSD is a powerful hallucinogenic. It can make you see and hear things that aren't there. One common effect is that time can feel like it's slowing down, as Hofmann experienced. You might also see kaleidoscopic visual imagery, feel changes in your body image, and have mystical type experiences too. All of this is going on inside your brain. And LSD is actually incredibly free love about the whole thing. It affects tons of your nerves' receptors, including dopamine receptors, adrenergic receptors, and serotonin receptors. That last one is particularly interesting, especially for hallucinations. Serotonin appears elsewhere in the body, but as a neurotransmitter, it's got a big role in the brain, where it's involved in your mood, feelings, and sleep patterns. The receptor involved in making you hallucinate is a type of serotonin receptor called 5-HT2A. Now, these 5-HT2A receptors are found in your brain where they play a big role in the visual cortex, hence the weird, trippy visuals. But interestingly, they're also found in your gastrointestinal tract and your circulatory system too. Now, if I'm honest, science doesn't really understand exactly how LSD acts on these receptors to produce hallucinations. There are a bunch of ideas, including one from Professor Jack Cohen. He's a mathematical biologist and he believes that the characteristic lines and kaleidoscope patterns seen when you're tripping arise because of the innate tendency of the brain to make patterns when it becomes unstable. And he's even built a computer model that can hallucinate. So, is any of this stuff dangerous? Well, there have been very few known cases of LSD overdose, and most actually happened when people thought it was another drug. In 1972, 8 people mistook it for cocaine and snorted a huge amount. They ended up very unwell, bleeding internally and in a comatose state, but all did survive and recover. Although one recent American study would suggest there is no link between LSD use and mental health, the jury is most definitely still out on its long-term effects, especially for people with a susceptibility to mental illness. But in controlled conditions, there may even be some positive effects. Some are arguing for using LSD and other psychedelics to treat depression, or even to help terminally ill patients come to terms with their impending death. The wife of author Aldous Huxley reported that she gave him LSD on his deathbed at his request, and that he had the most beautiful death. Still, the effects of a trip can be terrifying, especially if you're in an unsafe space, feel nervous, or have a history of mental issues. Plus, you can also have flashbacks months later, and people have been known to hurt themselves while tripping. Also, because it's a Class A drug, the people selling it are not exactly Mr. Trustworthy. In 2014, 5 people were charged with murder when a girl died after taking their synthetic LSD. So please, don't just try anything someone hands you at a party. And that goes double if they work for the CIA. Yep, throughout its history, LSD has been used for some pretty messed up things. In America, in the 1950s, the MK Ultra program involved the military and the CIA secretly slipping LSD to prison inmates, their own party guests, and people who visited prostitutes. This ludicrously unethical experimentation caused a huge amount of suffering and lies behind many conspiracy theories today. That doesn't take the cake for the strangest use of LSD though. For my money, that would be the 1962 elephant on acid experiment. They gave Tusco the elephant 297 milligrams of LSD, an enormous dose. He reacted badly, and while they were trying to calm him down, the researchers managed to kill him. Poor Tusco. To end on a happier note, you might be pleased to hear that researchers at Imperial College London have completed the first modern imaging study into the effects of LSD on the brain, and a crowdfunding campaign to complete the research raised double its original goal. Now that sounds like a better way to look in the mind. No psychedelics required. Oh, bonus fact. Talking of animal antics, good one to leave you with. Although LSD has a long association with Alice in Wonderland and white rabbits, rabbits are actually the animal that is most sensitive to overdose.
I don't know about you, but every so often I worry about the size of strangers' brains, especially when I'm watching talk shows. But do brains really come in different sizes? And if you were missing half, naturally or through some horrible accident, would you know? Let's clear something up first. It's not how big it is that matters. Yep, brain size is not actually a great predictor of intelligence. Want to know the vertebrate with the biggest brain to body mass ratio? It's the shrew. Men, on average, tend to have larger brain volumes than women, but this may be a result of their generally larger body size. And Neanderthals also had larger brains than modern humans, and while they may have been great at making cave art, they certainly aren't what springs to mind when you think of a genius. So, it seems that what you do with it is more important than how big it is. And strangely enough, that seems to hold true even if you're completely missing large portions of it. In 2014, scientists realized that a 24-year-old Chinese woman had actually been born completely without a cerebellum, the bit of the brain at the back of the skull that coordinates and regulates the activity of your muscles. But she seemed to have been living fairly happily. all while missing a part of the brain that animals have had since we first decided backbones were a good idea. Our friends over at BBC Future have actually written a whole article about this. People like this lady, or the case of a man who had a tapeworm burrow straight through his head, show just how little we understand about how our brains work and which bits are essential. The brain is clearly very flexible, and key tasks seem to be supported by lots of different areas. Now, half of what I love about science is finding out how we actually came to know all this incredible stuff. And in the case of brain science, a lot of this knowledge comes from really, really unfortunate people. You see, it's just very hard to get ethics committee approval to knock out half of someone's brain and then see what happens. Instead, neuroscientists have to be patient and wait until the person with the right injury comes along. One of the first and most famous of these people was Phineas Gage. A handsome railroad foreman, Gage's life was changed forever in 1848 when a tamping iron, an inch-wide iron rod used for tapping down gunpowder, was sent flying by an explosion, straight through his head. Now, it exited the back of his skull and landed several feet away, and helpful bystanders noted that it was greasy with his brain tissue. The poor guy was rushed to the doctor and incredibly survived. But his personality had changed. Previously a reasonable chap, he now spoke words that were described as the grossest profanity and apparently had little deference for his fellows. Gage gave us an insight into what happens when you get rid of parts of someone's brain. His case was the first to suggest a link between brain trauma and personality change. Doctors were especially interested because he'd injured his frontal lobe, a part of the brain that they had previously thought just didn't really do much. We now know that the two frontal lobes actually contribute to almost every activity in the brain and are especially important in impulse control and in making plans for the future. Recently though, people have been questioning how important any one area of the brain really is. After all, even Mr. Gage somewhat recovered and lived a pretty full life for a few years, travelling and working as a coachman. These case studies suggest that the brain is plastic, which, no, does not mean that it's made of Lego, but rather that it can reshape and rewire itself to get around changes. Essentially, it's regenerating. In fact, the brain may be even more malleable after injury. Neuroplasticity is a really exciting field. We're finding out just how much brains can change and how everything from gaming to running can reshape your brain. Maybe we've even done that here on BritLab. In which case, I am so sorry. The moral of this story though is that brains are pretty amazing. They can adapt and work around almost anything. So thank your brain today, however much you have of it, because it might not be the same brain as when you check in on it in even a week's time. A while back, I did a video about what LSD does to your brain, and it was a popular one. So now we're back to talk doobs, blunts, chronic, the stickiest of the icky, or, if you're a 60s hippie, Sweet Mary Jane. That's right, this time we're talking about cannabis. Plants of the cannabis genus, also known as marijuana or weed, occupy a very weird place in our society. In some places in the world, they're a completely legal drug like tobacco or booze, but in others, carrying some can send you straight to jail. Cannabis might well be the most widely used illicit drug in the world, so it's time to take a look at what this plant actually is all about and what is it doing to your brain. Cannabis has been around for a long time. There are records of its use back in 4000 BC. We've actually dug up stashes that are 2,700 years old. The active ingredient in the plant is mainly tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC for short, along with some other cannabinoids. The ones we probably study the most is simply called cannabidiol. Now, the cannabinoids are concentrated in hair-like structures on the plant called trichomes, which evolved to protect the leaves from being eaten by animals and insects. And as the plant ripens, THC-rich resin and oil glands start to appear, concentrated around the future flowers, the buds. And it's these buds that people are often purchasing if they buy the drug. Okay, so THC is the active ingredient, but what is it actually doing to your brain? Well, we still don't really know all the details. What we do know though is that THC primarily affects the cannabinoid receptors in the brain, the CB1 receptors. And it's these receptors that affect short-term memory, coordination, and problem solving. Now, your body actually makes a natural cannabinoid that activates the CB1 receptors, and by overstimulating them, you are basically experiencing a bit of brain damage, albeit short-term and reversible. But hey, No worries, because THC also leads to the release of dopamine, so you're happy about it. So what about the other cannabinoids in the plant though? Well, it's thought that cannabidiol might actually counteract some of the effects of THC and possibly be the source of the sedative and calming feelings. The overall effect also depends on how you partake in cannabis. Now, most people smoke it in joints in the form of leafy looking herbal grass or weed, or the squidgy extracted resin, usually called hash. The stronger varieties are normally called skunk. Now, increasingly people are actually vaping it as well, but it can be eaten in food made with cannabis-infused fat. And each of these methods can have different effects. For example, some people have a bad time with edibles because they take longer to take effect, so they keep scoffing them and then they're suddenly hit with a huge dose. A joint also has tar in it, like a regular cigarette, so it's just as bad for your lungs as tobacco smoke. So, no matter how it gets into your system, what does it do when it gets there? Well, almost immediately, some people feel less anxious and in a better mood. Or they get the giggles, and you might even get the munchies, which comes as a result of the THC binding to receptors in the hypothalamus, inhibiting the chemical signals that tell us not to eat. Oh, and it also seems to ramp up the sense of smell a bit as well. Less fun than eating everything in your fridge, you might experience a whitey, feeling faint or sick. And we do know that THC can directly cause paranoid thoughts. Now, that paranoid stoner stereotype actually turns out to have some basis in fact. The real risks, though, are thought to be on the development of the young brain. Cannabis probably isn't as addictive as, say, nicotine, but some people do find that they become dependent on cannabis and suffer from insomnia or anxiety if they try to stop. In the past decade, the number of under 18s seeking treatment for their cannabis use has risen by a whopping 50%. And that's a big worry, since it's fairly well accepted that there is at least a correlation between smoking pot and an increased risk in developing schizophrenia. And that holds true even if you adjust for selection bias. Now, that's the idea of people developing schizophrenia may well be more likely to then self-medicate by smoking weed in the first place. The link is even clearer in young people with a family history of mental illness. When they use cannabis, they increase their risk of developing a chronic psychotic disorder like schizophrenia. And the more cannabis they consume, the higher the risk. And the risk seems to be higher with young people, but it's not really clear why. Certainly, prolonged exposure to THC seems to deplete a natural endocannabinoid in the brain, which may leave more people more vulnerable to psychosis. Another recent problem is that skunk could be becoming more potent, with strains of cannabis being selectively bred to increase the levels of THC. Now, as the plant makes both THC and cannabidiol from the same starting material, if they're bred for more of one, then that leads to decreases in the amount of the other. And if it's maxed out with THC, there will be hardly any cannabidiol, which is not a good thing because, as I said before, cannabidiol can counteract the effects of THC, one of the effects that seems to be the link to psychosis. Before I wrap this up, I should mention the medical benefits of cannabis too. Now, there is general agreement that it's helpful in treating pain, especially nerve pain, and in helping control the nausea and sickness that people often get after chemotherapy. And it can even help people deal with muscle spasms caused by MS. And a drug based on THC and cannabidiol is prescribed for this in the UK. So, there you have it. There's a lot going on in that little green plant, and it does seem like its benefits and its disadvantages will continue to be debated for years to come. Me? Well, I'm going to continue to get my highs the legal way, with some bubble bath, some easy listening jazz, and a non-branded hot malted milk beverage. The brain really is a remarkable thing. Wow. Most people's brains. A brain is composed of nothing more than a jumble of neurons and blood vessels, and yet somehow it's the root of our consciousness, our personality, and reasoning. Plus, it's the only organ to have named itself. Mine's called Brian. Brian the brain. It's an anagram. Forget it. But that's downright foolish, I hear you cry. Brains can't have names like Brian. They've got no gender. Well, in the age-old and, I should add, very important debate about gender equality, surely our brain should be front and centre of that chat. So, what do we know? Are male and female brains really different? Now wait, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, Greg mate, get with the times. What's with this rigid man-woman thing? Gender's fluid. Don't put us in a box. But historically, there have only been two boxes, and men and women have been treated like they come from different planets. So I want to know if there's any basis for it inside our skulls. When it comes to what men and women can and cannot do, stereotypes abound. We've all heard how men are supposed to have better spatial reasoning, while women are much more caring and are better at multitasking. But nobody likes to feel genetically inferior just because of the contents of their underwear. So countless scientific studies have set out to really dig down into the truth of our gender differences. And here's the thing. When it comes to behaviour, some of the stereotypes do seem to be supported by the evidence. Men, for instance, do seem to be better at navigating. In a study that asked participants to navigate a virtual maze, men performed 50% better than women. That was partly down to how men attempted to find their way, choosing to use compass directions to head in roughly the right direction, whereas women attempted to memorise a specific route to follow. And women really are better at multitasking. Researchers gave both men and women 8 minutes to complete 3 tasks: solving maths problems, finding restaurants on a map, and figuring out how to find a lost key in a field. But they then surprised participants with a phone call in the middle of the task. If they answered, they were subjected to a general knowledge quiz. The results revealed that the women coped pretty well with juggling all 4 tasks at once, but the men crumbled and became illogical in looking for the lost key, something their superior spatial reasoning should have helped them with. Here's one bit of good news for us blokes and our spatial reasoning though. We are in fact a bit better at putting together flat pack furniture than the female of the species. Yeah, in an investigation sponsored by IKEA, men were able to assemble a trolley more accurately and more quickly than women, both with and without the instructions. That's that one settled, with actual data, right? Well, while these types of conclusions may seem compelling, they should be taken with a pinch, nay, a handful of salt. Thanks to behaviour studies' complicated experimental design, the number of participants is usually small. In general, when it comes to this kind of research, the more people studied, the larger the sample size, then the better idea we have of what's really going on. But with just a small sample size, we can't be sure of how the findings translate to the population as a whole, or how they might differ between ethnic groups or people of different ages. Plus, and this is a big one, just because men or women might be more likely to behave in a certain way doesn't mean that their behaviour is caused by their gender. It's incredibly tricky to separate any real gender differences from the effects of our cultural conditioning. Trust me, dressing a girl in pink and giving a boy a toy car is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to society's gender norms. Growing up within these norms does shape our behaviour, so it becomes difficult to align any particular actions with any hardwired differences in our brains. To find those, we need to turn our attention to the brain's structure as opposed to its function. The latest studies have used magnetic resonance imaging to study the brains of thousands of participants, and the results that are emerging seem to go against our gendered brain stereotypes. There are some slight differences between the brains of self-identified men and women. Men's brains tend to be larger overall, whilst women's have thicker cortexes, the outer layer of the brain that's involved with cognitive function. But the remarkable thing is that there seems to be no purely male brains versus female brains. While some features are more commonly seen in either men or women, each individual will have a combination of typically male and typically female features patched together in their brain like a mosaic. And there are so many possible pictures that this mosaic can form that there is scope for limitless variation. If I handed you a brain right now and you weren't completely grossed out, I'd be willing to bet that you couldn't tell if it was a Brian or a Bryony. And that's probably refreshing news to many. The fact that a brain isn't male or female, it isn't binary, is totally in line with our growing awareness and appreciation of how gender itself can be non-binary.
Can we switch our brains on and off? Not really. Your brain is always doing something, even if you're fast asleep. But thanks to a brilliant mashup of brain cells and algae and fiber optic cable, we can throw a switch on specific bits of the brain. Neuroscience in the last few years has gone through a revolution. It's been a fairly quiet revolution. There hasn't been a lot of flag waving or guillotining, but the way that a lot of us study brain cells and networks in the brain has changed forever. The new technique, which is a hot tip for a Nobel in a few years' time, is called Optogenetics, which is kind of a clunky name, but what it means is that we can use genes to control brain cells with light. That's right, in labs all around the world right now, neuroscientists are turning brain cells on and off using tiny beams of light. This is pretty awesome because up until now, the best way that we could make brain cells fire was by sticking in an electrode somewhere in the brain, connecting that to a power source and throwing the switch. That's a blunt tool because it's very hard to know how much of the brain and what type of brain cells you're turning on. So how does optogenetics work? Well, when a brain cell, a neuron, fires, lots of little channels open up on its surface. These channels let loads of charged ions into and then out of the cell. And this sets off a wave of charge that flows all the way down the neuron's fibers and sends the signal to other neurons. Now, what some scientists did about 9 years ago in Stanford was pinch an ion channel from an algae. This ion channel opens when it's hit with light. So the algae would normally use that channel to swim around and find the right light conditions for it to grow. But if we take the gene for that channel and put it into a neuron, and then shine light on the neuron, it sets off the same wave of charge. It makes the brain cell fire. Or if we use a different type of channel that sends charge in the other direction, we can stop brain cells firing. So by installing the genes for different types of channel in different types of brain cell, we can turn specific circuits in the brain on and off using different colors of light. It's as if the brain is a massive orchestra and the conductor just has a bunch of different colored laser pointers, and he can go, you, stop, and now you, start. Good, keep going, stop, and now you. This is really exciting, not just for neuroscientists, but for all of us. We can start to figure out how specific types of brain cell, in particular bits of the brain, affect what we do and who we are, and even how the brain goes wrong when it's not working properly. Already just this year, a group of scientists in Japan implanted a fiber optic cable in the brain of a mouse and shone a light to shut down a specific type of cell, and the mouse went to sleep. Another team in the US turned on a light inside a rat's brain and stopped epileptic seizures just by shutting down a different type of brain cell. Others have found that if you stimulate a particular circuit, you can tip mice into obsessive grooming, a bit like OCD. Or if you shut down another type of brain cell, you can help them get over cocaine addiction. It's a new era, it's incredibly powerful, and one day we might even see people treated with optogenetics. It won't be easy because first we have to get the genes into the right brain cells, which will probably mean injecting a virus. And then we'll have to insert a fiber optic cable to turn the cells on or off. But if we can get it to work, it'll be incredibly precise, especially if you compare it to sticking in an electrode or bathing the whole brain in drugs, which is basically what we're left with at the moment in a lot of situations. So, optogenetics, genetic light switches for the brain. Kind of a funny name, but a very bright future.
Here on Earth Lab, I've done a lot of drugs. LSD, cannabis, even steroids, and I am not done yet. I'm going to go for the full set because unlike actual drug abuse, you won't have any nasty side effects from an overdose of science. Although I can't promise you won't find it mildly addictive. So, let's take a look at what heroin does to the body. Also known as smack, skag, horse, gear, and brown, heroin has a colourful and lengthy history. The drug has its roots, so to speak, in the opium poppy. Evidence of the cultivation of these poppies has been found as far back as Neolithic times, more than 6,000 years ago. Poppies were slit open and their opium-containing sap collected and consumed. In this way, opium remained a popular drug for millennia. Opium dens, supposedly frequented by a certain Mr. Holmes, were especially common during the 1800s, and it was around 1810 that the drug morphine was first extracted from the resin of the opium poppy. Morphine had incredible pain-killing effects, producing a state of numbness and euphoria that made it the go-to drug for surgery. And it's still used today when other painkillers just don't cut the mustard. But there was a problem. At the time, little was known about how addictive morphine could be, and it was used so liberally during the American Civil War that it left tens of thousands of soldiers hopelessly addicted and dependent on the drug. In response to this, heroin made its grand entrance. Derived from morphine by German scientists, it was marketed as the new wonder drug, a safe and non-addictive alternative to morphine. It could be used to treat everything from headaches and colds to depression and even old age. But, spoiler alert, heroin wasn't non-addictive at all. In fact, it was still very, very addictive, and following decades of unregulated and legal over-the-counter distribution, even free samples being sent in the post, by the beginning of the 20th century there were hundreds of thousands of heroin addicts worldwide. Heroin was severely restricted under the Geneva Convention in 1925, and in the UK it's now a Class A illegal drug, but that doesn't deter some from seeking its mood and mind-altering effects. So, how does it work? When injected or smoked, the active chemical compound in heroin, diamorphine, is able to reach the brain quickly via the blood. Once in the brain, enzymes convert it to morphine, and that starts to alter the balance of natural chemicals in the nervous system. Zooming in on the brain, you'd find billions of neurons responsible for relaying information, and between them billions of connections called synapses. At the synapses, the heroin-derived morphine binds to specific opioid receptors, and that triggers the release of dopamine, one of your so-called feel-good hormones. As more and more heroin reaches the brain and tricks it into releasing more and more dopamine, users experience something that's often described as a rush of euphoria. And while that might not sound too bad, it's only the tip of the heroin iceberg. What follows is much more dangerous and damaging. Let's not forget that diamorphine and morphine are primarily painkillers, and that's in part because of their slowing effects on the nervous system. After the initial rush of dopamine euphoria, heroin users will begin to feel drowsy. They'll be unable to think clearly, and their heart rate and breathing rate will be severely slowed. And it's this last one that is particularly dangerous, because without enough oxygen getting into the blood and the brain, you risk coma and brain damage. That lethargic funk can last for several hours, depending on the dose. But even if you manage to avoid the perils of a heroin trip, the danger is far from over. That's because, just like its predecessors morphine and opium, heroin is unbelievably addictive. Even after using it once, you can build up both tolerance and physical dependence that change your brain and your behaviour forever. Tolerance is where the intensity of the drug's effects decrease each time it's taken, meaning you need to take more to achieve the same high, and when you take more, the slowing effects are greater and longer lasting, putting you at more and more risk. And physical dependence, that's where the body simply adapts to having the drug within it. And whenever you don't have heroin in your system, you experience truly horrible withdrawal symptoms like diarrhea and vomiting and muscle pain, restlessness, insomnia. Basically, once you're addicted to heroin, which is horrendously easy to do, seeking and taking more of the drug becomes your sole purpose in life, and that is not a cool way to live. It's not just the psychological effects that are distressing either. Evidence shows that the continued presence of the heroin in the brain can fundamentally change its structure and function, and those changes are not easily reversed. White matter, the critical pathways between the information-containing parts of the brain, can deteriorate, making it harder for a user to make decisions or react to situations appropriately. Add that to the damage to the nasal septum that comes from repeatedly snorting the heroin, or the scarring and infection from injecting the drug straight into the blood, and suddenly heroin isn't looking so much like a wonder drug, more a slippery slope to destruction. I think if anything deserves a prize for short-term gain outweighed by long-term pain, heroin will be right up on the podium. What started out as an innocent experiment in pain relief now affects more than 17 million people worldwide, and its use is on the rise, with heroin topping the charts for drug-related deaths and health problems. I think I'm going to give it a miss, guys. I'm going to shoot hoops, not heroin. Yeah, that was awful when I wrote it.